So before we get started on this lesson, here's a little thing for you to think about. Um, Sweet wrappers, candy wrappers, we all know it's wrong to drop them in the street, but what suddenly makes it right if we just drop them in a trash can and that trash can is taken to a landfill? Surely that is exactly the same thing. Okay, so hopefully if you pause this and you've had a little think about what happens with all of those candy wrappers. This section of work asks us to discuss the reduction of resource consumption by conservation, waste reduction, recycling and substitution. Let's have a think about what discuss means. I'll let you have a read of what discuss means. And there you'll see that it's a range of arguments and factors or hypothesis. So if you get a discuss question, it's going to want you to talk about more than one factor and more than one idea. So let's have a look at this question in another way. Does conservation, waste reduction, recycling and substitution actually reduce resource consumption? Now you may automatically think that it does, but actually would one of these things done individually, would that actually have an impact on the consumption of a resource? So some definitions for you to have a look at are conservation, recycling, reuse, reduction and substitution. You almost want to also have a look at landfill and fly tipping. Okay, so here's the concept that by doing these things we can reduce the consumption of a particular resource, and of course you probably guessed it, the resource that we're going to look at is oil. So by conservation, reducing the waste of oil, recycling and substitution together, does that mean that we're going to consume less oil? Now you might think automatically that if we do those things we will reduce the amount of oil that we consume, but there's a real risk here that the easier we make it to reduce the amount of, conserve the amount of oil that we use, it's kind of getting us into a false sense of security. I don't need to save oil, or personally I don't need to start consuming less because of what society is doing in general. But before we do that, I'd like us to think about recycling. Now recycling will probably be relevant to the other resource that you're independently going to think about. What is wrong with recycling? Well, here we see a little Chinese baby, and this baby is actually in the middle of a recycling plant. Here it's an issue of e-waste, and that's where all of our computers and electronic items go, and many of them go to places like this. A lot of them will go to mainland China, where they are recycled because that's good for the environment. They're recycled in a really hazardous environment. You have to think, after you've watched this video on e-waste and done a little bit of research on e-waste, read the CBS news article as well. Is recycling actually what we should be doing with our electronic waste? Or with our electronic waste, would it actually be better if we use it for as long as we possibly can, or even better, don't produce it in the first place? There's some more articles here. That's a very good article from the Guardian newspaper that asks us to consider, is it ethically right to import our waste, our electronic waste, into countries like China? And incidentally, a lot of that electronic waste will get into China via Hong Kong. In fact, it used to be recycled in Hong Kong. You do still see a little bit of that around now, but not so much because the government have actually done a very good job at controlling it. But this horrible recycling industry and recycling of e-waste has moved on to mainland China. So, as we said here, a good answer will comment on conservation, substitution and recycling. And recycling can also include reuse, but for a resource like petroleum, reuse and recycling is not really an option for us. So got to evaluate a strategy at a local and national scale. Now in Planet Geography it talks about Australia and New Zealand. There's also some information that you can make notes on California's attempt to reduce petrol consumption. This video very much looks at technology in reducing the consumption of oil. The problem is that whenever you actually put in any technology to make the mileage of a car more efficient, for example, people actually don't modify their behaviour. In fact, they could end up actually driving more miles because it becomes cheaper and they're spending less money on fuel. So any of those benefits of increased fuel consumption will be outweighed by people making longer journeys because they can afford to pay the gasoline charges for those longer journeys. So have to think about this. It's not just about the technology, but it's the way that we use it as a society. If you click this link here, it will take you to a Digo link, and what I've done is I've highlighted some really important, what I would consider to be the important things from the CFR from the USA. If you're not sure what the CFR is, it's the Council for Foreign Relations, and they've done a lot of work on the USA and its reliance on oil. This of course brings us back to our previous section of work where we talked about the geopolitical consequences of increased oil consumption. So they've got a policy, or they are suggesting a policy for the United States of America to reduce the amount of oil that is consumed. As a country, what they want to do is they want to completely end the use of oil for heating. This is very inefficient and now very costly because oil prices are so high. The other thing they want to do is develop a mixture of transport options. And notice this doesn't just say about having electric cars, it says that a mixture of transport options. So what's the most number of options, and people will be able to choose or be guided in their choice in the most appropriate one. One of the big savings that a country like the USA will be able to achieve is if they stop domestic flights, short-haul domestic flights, and replace these with high-speed rail links or HSRs. Certainly in China, the amount of high-speed rail links that are being built in mainland China, you can see this is a definite policy of the Chinese government to have a more efficient economy in the medium to long term. And by having all of those high-speed rail links, China will reduce its dependence and consumption of oil considerably, rather than going down the more American route of having a vast internal flight network. Moving on, we can see here that still the USA still uses oil for the generation of electricity, and this is extremely wasteful. There are a lot better and more efficient ways of generating electricity. More efficient engines. As you said before, number 5, more efficient engines, is kind of a double-edged sword. What we have to do is, yes, of course it's very good to have the more efficient engines, but we also need to modify people's behaviour and perception of the cost of travel. So what we don't want to do is make the cars really efficient. It would be the reaction that, okay, because my car is so efficient, I can double my journey time because number one, I can afford that longer journey, and number two as well, I'm a really green person and therefore I can drive further because I'm not doing so much damage to the environment. Psychologically, it's quite an easy thing to do, to convince yourself that actually by driving these cars you're helping the environment. Well, of course it would be better not to drive them in the first place because the energy does have to come from somewhere. Oil tax. For the USA, they suggest a oil tax rather than a gasoline tax or petrol tax. While a large amount of oil is used for transportation, that's not the only part of the picture. Oil, as we've said, is used for other purposes, especially electricity generation and for heating buildings. The policy suggests that there should be less emphasis on plug-in cars. For a start, the CFR say this is a very narrow focus and can remove attention from the real issue, which is the transportation industry in general. We go back to this psychological relationship you have. If you have a plug-in car, or if you start to use plug-in cars, you're doing lots and lots of good for the environment, so you need to worry less about the rest. If you've got a whole fleet of vehicles, you don't need to worry so much, because oh yes, 5% of mine are plug-in cars. It doesn't really solve the issue. Specifically, if we're talking about reducing the consumption of oil as well, it's absolutely pointless if you then just plug in your car, charge up the batteries, and that electricity was produced using oil. In the long term, they talk about repositioning or restructuring society to use less oil. This is really important, because any increase in the price of oil will initially have a reaction from consumers, where you'll start driving your car less and buying more fuel efficient cars, but over a period of time you become more and more used to those prices, and unless you start modifying the society in general, you'll go back to your previous consumption patterns as you accept the new level, accept the new pricing structure. Number 9, it does talk about developing the use of electric vehicles, but specifically they do not really want to develop the use of electric cars, private electric cars. What they want to do is electric vehicles in the form of buses and trains. The organisations say that if you just do these things, that's not enough. You need to do other things as well, and they've suggested the following legal structures. At the moment in the USA, as any board member of BP will be able to tell you, at the moment there's a $75 million compensation ceiling for oils. The company doesn't have to pay out any more than $75 million if they have an oil spill. By removing this, you're forcing companies to stop going for high risk oil ventures, so it could encourage them to say, okay, the costs and risks are just becoming too expensive, and we'll pursue other sources of energies. There's also a 45 mile per gallon fuel economy standard for cars and light trucks by 2022, and they want to also establish the first fuel economy standards for trucks. Again, we need to be very, very cautious with this one for all the reasons, because it might not actually overall reduce the consumption of oil, because as people will be spending less money on fuel, they'll just increase their journey times. Quite often when people fill up their car, they won't fill it up by the number of litres, but they'll fill it up by the money that they're putting into it. Number 3, trucks and buses running on natural gas, and there's something called the Nat Gas Act, which the USA this pressure group wants to enforce in the USA. We've already got most taxis in Hong Kong running on natural gas. Of course, this will reduce the consumption of oil, but you're still consuming a finite resource. You've just changed the resource that you're using from oil to gas. They also want to power cars with electricity and enacting the Electric Driver Vehicle Deployment Act. But again, with any of these legislations, it might reduce marginally the consumption of oil, but on the consumption of energy resources, there'll be very little impact. The other one is they want to invoke something called the Trade Expansion Act, and that's to place a levy on oil imported into the United States of America. That's to encourage energy companies in America to look at clean energy infrastructure and start pursuing other forms of energy within the United States. Again, holistically have a think about this, because if that means that the companies will then start using the more risky technology to exploit oil within the boundaries of the United States, that's not a good place to go, and it wouldn't necessarily reduce the consumption of oil. And also we're talking about fracking as well, which has many environmental impacts. So always ask yourself, will this reduce significantly the consumption of the particular resource.